In this video, I'm going to quickly run through the expectations for papers. I have here in front of me a copy of the grading rubric that I use. If you can't quite read this on the video, it's obviously posted on Canvas. Before you turn in a paper, you'll definitely want to go through this rubric in some detail and make sure that you've done everything that I'm expecting here. When I grade your paper, I'll have a printed hard copy of this exact rubric in front of me. And as I read through the paper, I'm going to either start to check off each of these boxes, indicating that you've received full credit, or I'm going to start to reduce your grade accordingly. So word to the wise, obviously go through this rubric in some detail before you turn in your final paper. And again, if you can't quite read what's written here, it's posted on Canvas. Papers are worth 100 points apiece. So if you take a 0 on a paper, if you fail to turn in a paper, 0 out of 100 is going to have a huge negative impact on your grade. If you don't turn in any papers at all for the quarter, then really it becomes nearly impossible to pass the class. And since that's a decent chunk of your grade, I think it's only fair that I go through the rubric in some detail, making expectations perfectly clear. So let me actually start at the bottom of the rubric here with length guidelines. Notice on the right-hand side where points are discussed. By following the guidelines here, you don't actually receive credit, rather just the opposite. If you don't follow these guidelines, then your grade goes down accordingly. And in fact, when you turn in your paper, this is the first thing that I'm going to check. It's a short paper, so the paper is to be absolute bare minimum 3 pages in length. So what constitutes a page? And anal though it is, here I've given a lengthy definition of a page. First of all, it's got to be typed. Plenty of computer labs here around campus if you don't have a computer at home. 12-point type. If you're just short of a full 3 pages in writing, one of the tricks, of course, is to, well, forget about writing more. You just blow up the type and magically you're done. So I think that's pretty standard, 12-point type. Another trick is to mess with the font. Some fonts take up more space than others. So here I ask that you use pretty standard Times New Roman. Another trick is to shrink in the margins. So I ask for 1-inch margins all the way around. If that's not a part of the default setting, then obviously you'll have to change the setting for 1-inch margins all the way around. So 3-page paper, double spaced. So this is not by any stretch a long paper. Do double space, that gives me room to offer feedback. But I certainly don't want to see 2.5 spacing, triple spacing, quad spacing. I've actually seen that before. You got to be kidding me. Another issue is with respect to the heading. So here I ask that you put your name on it, of course, but that's all I need for the heading. So first of all, it's to be typed, but let me just give you an example of what I see on a regular basis. You put your name on it. I don't care if it's top left-hand corner, top right-hand corner. Obviously put your name on it first and last, but that's all I need for the header here. I often see, though, put your name on it, great, skip a space, and you put YVC, and then skip a space, and you put the quarter, and then you skip a space and put the year, and then you skip a space, of course, right, and put my name on it, as though I forget who I am. Skip a space, put the class, it's philosophy, it's the 101 section, and before you know it, your header here is taking up half the page. So cut all this nonsense, just put your name on it. If you want to have a title for your paper, that's fine, it's not required. Don't turn in a separate title page though, it's really just a waste of paper if you're going to turn in a printed hard copy as opposed to just uploading your paper to Canvas. Put your name only for the header, and then I want a full 3 pages of writing. So imagine then that this is page number 3 of your paper. I often get a couple of sentences on page 3, and you say, look, it's page number 3, I turned it into a 3-page paper. It's 2 pages of writing and maybe a couple of sentences here. It's not a full 3 pages of writing. I want a full 3 pages, absolute minimum. If it goes on to page 4, fine. No points will be deducted for going above and beyond, but a full 3 pages of writing. And as it says here clearly on the rubric, -5 for each quarter page short of 3 pages. So if you turn it in a 2-page paper, So first thing I'm going to look at, that's minus 20 before I've read the first sentence. And really from there, your grade is going to go down. If you turn in a 2-page paper, it's minus 20 right off the top. But then for a 2-page paper, your arguments are going to be detailed enough, and that 2-page paper quickly turns into a D or an F. So 3 pages, and that's what I mean by a page. One last item here, and then we'll move to the top of the rubric here. Put your name at the top, that's it. And then research is required, more coming there. But since you're required to do research, your sources have to be cited. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. And the penalty for plagiarism is, number 1, you'll receive an F. So since you're doing research, it's got to be cited. And I'm somewhat flexible here. But I do ask that if you're going to use notes for your citations, you don't have to use notes. You could do parenthetical citations if you like. But if you're going to use notes, I ask that you use endnotes and not footnotes. So if that's less than clear, let me clarify now. So suppose this is now page 1, and on page 1 you have a quote or maybe a summary. You've quoted, let's say, the text for the class, does the center hold? So if you're using notes at the end of this quote or summary, if this is the first quote / summary, you'd have a little 1 if you're using notes. And then for footnotes, at the bottom of the page where that quote appears, you'd have a corresponding 1 at the bottom of that page saying this is from Does the Center Hold, page 53, yada yada. If you use notes, I ask again, don't use footnotes where it appears at the bottom of the page, use endnotes. The corresponding 1, if you're using endnotes, should appear on the works cited page. So bare minimum, you need 3 pages, 3 full pages of writing, and there again is what I mean by a page, plus a separate works cited page or bibliography. And again, that's the bare minimum. So that's what I mean by a 3-page paper. And again, that's not a long paper. If you're struggling to come up with 3 pages, then let me suggest you're not thinking deeply enough about the issue at hand. So let's get to the top here. And again, if you can't quite read this, it's posted on Canvas for your convenience. So at the top, this is where the rubric discusses research. You are to use between 2 and 3 sources, no more, no less. No more than 3, no less than 2. Why put a cap on the amount of sources that you can use? I think this is just good, general, solid advice here. You want to have no more than 1 source per page. 3-page paper, maximum of 3. If you try to incorporate more than 3 sources into a 3-page paper, research is going to come to dominate your paper. At that point, it's not really going to be your paper. It's going to read as though you've cut and pasted from a bunch of other papers. So that's why I put a maximum, but a minimum of 2. One of those has to be, as mentioned here, from the YVC library. Now that doesn't require that you go into the library and check out a physical book. That certainly would count. I would actually encourage you, if you're struggling with your research, to meet with a librarian. They can help point you in the right direction. So anything that you physically check out from the library, that counts, but that's not actually required. You're free to use any of the databases that you access via the school's website. So on your works cited page, on your bibliography, I just ask that you indicate that this is your library source, and you'll receive full credit. For the citation part, I'm actually quite flexible. You can use MLA, APA, or Chicago style. If anybody's actually familiar with Chicago style, it's often required for various philosophy journals, but I'm fine with either MLA or APA. So at least 1 has to be from library. All of them could be library sources, but 1 has to be from the library. Aside from the library, what else counts as an acceptable source? Well, here is a list of acceptable sources. Any primary source. So if you're writing a paper on Plato or Descartes, it would make sense to take a look at Plato, to take a look at Descartes. Any primary source counts. The book counts, depending on the topic. You bought the book, you might as well use it. You can use Does the Center Hold, Any Edition by Donald Palmer. That's not to count as your library source, but you can use the book for the class. And then if you want to do some research online, there's an awful lot of junk online. So I would recommend starting with either the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And if you forget this, just go to the rubric on Canvas. These links are hyperlinked So you can go directly from the rubric to either the Stanford Encyclopedia or the Internet Encyclopedia, aside from the library and aside from the book. Two great places to start your research. So once you've done research, the purpose number one of doing research is to have a better understanding of the question, and then you can use research to either refute or support a claim. But once you've done some research and you understand the question that you're wrestling with, then formulate a thesis. So above all, let me be clear here, your papers for philosophy are to be argumentative papers. They're not informative papers, they are to be argumentative papers. So take a stance, that's what I mean when I say thesis. Take a stance, and then in the body of your paper, be prepared to back it up. I'm not going to assume that deep down inside you agree with the stance that you're taking for the purposes of your paper. Feel free to play devil's advocate. How would I know after all? Take a stance, whether or not you agree with it, and be prepared to back it up. So this should appear in your opening paragraph. By the time I read the first paragraph, I want to know what paper topic you're addressing and what stance that you've taken. You can find the specific paper prompts, again, on Canvas. It's clearly labeled paper topics. So you'll notice for many of the topics, there are multiple questions. That just gives a little bit more flexibility. Pick only one of those questions. Don't try to tackle both. That's way too much for a 3-page paper. But you'll notice that the paper prompts are given to you. There are 5 different topics to select from. You're only responsible for 2. Each comes with its own due date. So again, quite a bit of flexibility. You can pick any 2 topics with the corresponding due date. And if multiple questions are listed, again, more flexibility. Pick only one of those questions. Do some research so that you understand the question, and then take a stance in the opening paragraph. The body of your paper then, the body of your paper, that's to be your supporting arguments. Take a stance, back it up with arguments. And here I've given you a couple pointers. Number 1, have a narrow focus. Have a narrow focus. It's a short paper. You can't tackle all possible issues. You have to narrow the focus. What I'm looking for here is more depth, more detail, rather than addressing a whole host of issues really quickly. So let me give you an example here. One of the popular paper topics is on philosophy of religion. The big question there is, does God exist? So for a 3-page paper, I sometimes see, for philosophy of religion, 3-page paper that tries to cover the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, and the problem of evil. It's 4 huge arguments, all in 3 pages. Well, that's going to be really shallow, really surface level analysis. Rather than covering a bunch of arguments quickly, cover 1 or 2 in more detail. The next pointer here, you are to write for an educated audience. So in other words, assume that the person that is reading your paper has already taken this class and has all of the relevant background information. Again, it's not an informative paper. It's not a summary paper. So you're not to summarize what you've read. You're not to summarize what's been posted on Canvas. You're not to summarize the reading assignments from Does This Center Hold? Assume, again, that the reader has all that relevant background information. Formulate your thesis, take a stance, and then dive right into the supporting arguments. As I've described it here, write for an educated audience. And let me also point out here that the fallacies covered in the opening week of the class, they're all built into the grading rubric here. So if your arguments are fallacious, obviously your grade goes down. Mastery of course material. Again, it's not a summary paper, but let's say you're writing on Plato. You're not going to summarize his theory of forms, the divided line, anything of the sort. You're assuming that the reader already has that general background information. But if you're writing a Plato paper and you don't really understand Plato's epistemology, even though you're not summarizing, that of course is going to shine through. Communication. It's not an English class. There is an English prereq. It's important that you be able to express yourself clearly in writing. So this includes things like organization, style, flow, grammar. By all means, run a spell check. If you need some assistance, I'm available, of course. but I would also encourage you to go to the Writing Center. It's on the first floor of Glen Anthon on the north side of campus. No appointment necessary, especially if you go early in the quarter. You can go in with even a rough draft, and they can help you structure your arguments. They can certainly help you with things like organization, style, flow, clarity, etc. Humility. This is the last section on the rubric that we haven't yet touched on. Humility. Again, it's a short paper, but you're required to respond to at least one objection. All these paper topics are fairly controversial. Not everybody's going to agree with the stance that you're taking in your paper. And this is where research can come into play as well. You can use research for the body of your paper, for your supporting arguments. You can use research to support a claim. Let me also encourage you to include research here. You can use research to refute a claim. So research somebody that disagrees with your stance, and don't just point out the objection, offer a response. Don't just point out the objection, take it to the next step. How are you going to respond to that objection? Again, you don't have time to take on all possible objections. It's just a short 3-page paper, but at least one objection is required. That's built into the grading rubric. So it should be a pretty simple structure. Take a stance, formulate your thesis, back it up with an argument or two, more detail, as opposed to covering a bunch of different arguments real quickly. Point out an objection, respond to that objection, and put it all together. There's your 3-page paper. If you'd like to meet, I'm available Monday through Friday. If my office hour doesn't work with your schedule, just let me know and we can make other arrangements. That's exactly what I'm looking for when I grade your paper. If you have questions, again, don't hesitate to ask. If you have questions about specific paper prompts, I'm, of course, available to answer your questions there as well. Thanks.